Everybody, it is 5 after, so we are officially going to kick things off. Thank you so much for joining. Can I go to the next slide, please? So just welcome again. My name is Mary Phillips. I am a technical advisor at PSI working on the Adolescent 360 project and based in the United States. It's my pleasure to be the moderator for today's event. We're so delighted with the turnout today and really excited to see so much interest in designing multi-component solutions for adolescent girls. So we're really hoping that you find today's presentation engaging and informative. Next slide. So I am pleased to introduce our panel of speakers today. All of our speakers were involved in the partnership and the work to design and bring to life the integrated solutions that you're going to hear about today. Emnet Ubashet-Teklu is the founding partner of DERS Consulting, a strategic design consultancy operating in Ethiopia and Kenya. And before starting DERS, Emnet worked with PSI Ethiopia as a senior HCD manager. Megan Kutherell is based in the United States and is a senior program manager for Adolescent 360 at PSI. Carrie Ellett is the Associate Director of Youth Empowerment at BRAC International and is based in Kenya. And Joy Adsanya Ede is the HCD Design and Adaptations Lead for SFH Nigeria, and she is, of course, based in Nigeria. Next slide, please. Here is a quick overview of what we're going to go through today. First, Megan is going to present on some background about the goals and objectives of this project and our partnership. Next, Carrie's going to speak about how we operationalize the partnership and BRAC's role as a technical partner throughout the design process. Emnet is then going to share some examples on how the evidence base for economic strengthening was used to accelerate and enhance the design process in Ethiopia. And then Joy will offer some additional examples of when the evidence base and user insights did not align and how we managed that. Then we are going to wrap up with a Q&A session. We're hoping to have a good amount of time. Note that there is an active open Q&A chat, which is working because I've seen some questions come through. So feel free to drop questions in throughout the presentations as they come up. We'll answer what we can as we go through, and then we should have plenty of time to discuss more at the end. And with that, I'm happy to hand it over to Megan. So over to you, Megan.
Thanks, Mary. Just again, welcome everyone, and we're really grateful for the turnout, and that demonstrates real interest in this topic area. So we really hope that the presentations will be informative, but also we really welcome your questions and hope to have a discussion more at the end. As Mary said, we want to start out by presenting a little bit of the background because I think it's important contextual information that will help you understand more about how we operationalized the partnership and what we did. So I'm going to do that first. Next slide. We know that integrated programming is an ambition for a lot of adolescent-focused programming. There's a value in taking an approach which centers the whole girl, acknowledges that she has diverse and overlapping needs. Girls tell us that they don't want to have to go to multiple sources to meet those interconnected needs. They want these multi-dimensional services that can meet them where they are with holistic support. The ecosystem of implementers and stakeholders that support girl-focused programming are often fragmented. We're housed in our own programmatic silos, and integration is a way for us to better engage and develop more effective solutions. It can also, in many cases, promote program and cost efficiencies by providing multiple services at one point of interaction. In many cases, it can also strengthen outcomes, though that's not the case in all instances. But as an example, in A360's own work, which you're going to hear about today, integrating economic empowerment components onto our existing SRH programs did increase SRH outcomes in many cases. So there's a clear rationale for integration, but why don't we all integrate? There's many reasons. We've talked about silos. In general, many organizations have specializations. We may lack the right expertise to expand into other areas. This is especially true when it comes to divergent areas like SRH and economic empowerment, where the technical scope is quite different. The evidence sometimes is clear, but how do we know that something which was tested in one place will work in our context In addition, the evidence is not always described in a way which is easy to apply. It could be very theory-based and not actually tailored to the needs of practitioners who are trying to figure out what could actually work in real life. And lastly, resources. That's something that's really hard to get beyond. Unless given explicit mandate and funds to integrate, it's really hard to make the case for its value, especially if as an organization, it's a new area, which comes with potential risks. Next slide. So the A360 project began implementing in 2016. The goal of the first investment phase for the project, which lasted through 2020, was to design and implement SRH interventions across 3 countries. We realized, it was very clear in talking to girls during our formative design phase, something that probably many of you hear, that they wanted support to achieve their goals broadly. And that included health and non-health goals. As a result of that, in our design process, we intentionally integrated components into our work which could support girls to tap into these aspirations. So including a skills-related component which could respond to girls' insights. And the resonance of the interventions that we designed really relied on these components. It made the program feel relevant to girls. And it also, in many cases, fostered the approval of their influencers and gatekeepers. But on the flip side, girls had high expectations for these components. They were really happy for the support that we could provide, but in many cases, the reality of what we were offering fell short of those expectations. For example, girls said they wanted to learn more marketable and diverse skills and have additional support to pursue income generation. So we could see there was value in strengthening and expanding these components so that we could provide something that was more substantive to girls to pursue their goals. Next slide. So as the result of some additional investment from one of A360's funders, we were able to do this, to pursue a design process to layer economic empowerment components onto those existing SRH interventions. We were looking for outcomes that were both economic in nature, so girls' improved ability to earn and save money, but also outcomes related to their power and agency. So the goal was to support girls not just to pursue their economic goals, but to do so in a way which expanded their decision-making power and autonomy. Next slide. We had a few specific goals for this process. So A360 has strong user-centered roots. From design to implementation to evaluation. We're very intentional about trying to center girls' lived experiences. And so it was clear that an HCD process or human-centered design process would be able to help us retain this commitment to being user-centered. But at the same time, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We knew there was a lot already in the evidence base about what works to promote girls' economic empowerment from various sources, and we wanted to use that evidence base effectively. And as a project with SRH expertise, this wasn't necessarily something that was directly in our wheelhouse. So using the evidence base effectively during design meant that we needed to have support structures which could help us tap into the evidence base effectively. So we recruited BRAC for this purpose. And lastly, within each design process that A360 has facilitated, we want to grow our local team's ability to feel greater and more ownership and leadership in the process. So we relied a lot more heavily on their growing expertise in design and their incredible knowledge of our program users. So we crafted the design process with that intentional local leadership in mind. Next slide. So here's the design process in a nutshell. May look complicated. I promise it wasn't in practice that complicated. As I mentioned, A360 has a tremendous amount of experience within its local teams already on design. So these teams in Ethiopia and Nigeria were the key drivers of the design process. They facilitated data collection and synthesis and really drove the conceptualization of the intervention design. We brought on board a design partner. A360 has done this in the past, but in this case, we tried to create limits and a time-bound nature to their engagement. They engaged the local design teams during the most intense design periods, so that includes from ideation through the end of rough prototyping. And in the past, though, our design partner's mandate has been more expansive to take more of a leadership role. In this case, they were asked more to be facilitators, so building local teams' capacity to drive the design process. And then, as I mentioned, BRAC, our technical partner, was engaged throughout the entire process, so not just a time-bound engagement, but from start to finish. They were a technical resource that could be activated at any point, and Carrie will speak a little bit more to the nuances of how that worked, as well as Emna and Joy. They engaged in the design process both at key design points, such as collaborating around draft prototypes or reviewing insight decks. But also whenever the design teams felt there was a problem they wanted to solve that the evidence base could help address. And as I mentioned, you'll hear more from our other panelists on how this worked later in the webinar. Next slide. And the result of this process is what you see here. So we had isolated out from the evidence base what we knew worked for girls' economic empowerment. These include things like group-based programming, led by mentors that include a combination of various types of skills programming. These skills are provided in a participatory way and not just skills development, but also development of critical consciousness. So girls' awareness of the limitations that gender and social norms put on them, so that we're working towards the development of their power and autonomy and not just economic outcomes. The group-based models often include pooling of savings, practicing of economic behaviors in a low-risk environment, and then after skills training, girls can often get some follow-up training and mentorship. The way in which these key components from the evidence base were translated look different across the different geographies, and Emna and Joy will provide a little bit of specifics on how that looks in Ethiopia and Nigeria. But with that overview, we are excited to share with you exactly how we collaborated in this process. And I'm going to hand it over next to Carrie to get into that specifics of how we operationalized TA.
Great. Thanks so much, Megan. So I'm excited to share with you a bit about the journey and the how we pulled this all together on the beginning side, the technical assistance side, before we got into implementation, which, as Megan mentioned, our other panelists will share after. So looking forward to sharing that and discussing during the Q&A. So next slide, please. What I'm going to start off with is just some information about BRAC International and why we would do something like this technical assistance with A360. So we have a couple of strategy points I wanted to mention. One is that we have a youth empowerment program, and the focus of our youth empowerment program is really to look at how do we provide holistic solutions to realize impact, particularly for adolescent girls and young women, but that also does mean sometimes engaging adolescent boys and young men. And so when we think about our holistic approach and what that means, because I know that word can get thrown around quite a bit, we look at a combination of social empowerment and economic empowerment. And so our programs for young people are always trying to bring those two elements together because we know what an impact that has currently on adolescents, particularly across the African continent, but also in Asia where we work as well. The other thing that we look at is how do we also do integrated programming across our work that we do. So BRAC does things in agriculture, microfinance, we have health programming, education programming, including early childhood development. We do ultra poor graduation. And so when we think about that sort of suite of programs that we have that have evidence base behind them, we're always trying to think about how do we break down the silos that can form in programs and really work on integration, because we know that many of the challenges that we're working on in development are complex. And so how do we bring together many different solutions and opportunities in order to solve some of those? So for integration, we're often looking at 50% of our participants at a minimum being engaged in integrated programming. And for the technical assistance, how we got there is one of the things that we started doing to think about operating at scale. And so if we can go to the next slide, please. So one of the things that BRAC looks at is when we think about integrated programming, we think about holistic programming, we are looking at creating impact at scale. And so we have some technical assistance services. We actually started technical assistance in our ultra poor graduation program quite a long time ago. And that has been ongoing and now has evolved into working directly with governments across the world. We've also done technical assistance in our youth empowerment program. And so this work we were doing with A360, as Megan had mentioned. And the goal of this really was to think about how do we support scaling of best practices. That's where we started initially. And the partnership with A360 in particular gave us a really great opportunity to work together on starting with human-centered design, moving through the processes of research and support and brainstorming to get to places where we can realize the most impact for young people. And we also were able to draw on some of our different programs. So while this particularly fell under the youth empowerment program, BRAC drew on lessons learned from things like microfinance and our ultra poor graduation program in order to provide technical assistance that had lots of evidence basis behind it and could really be adapted for whatever context we were working in. Thank you so much. If you could move to the next slide, please. And just a little bit about sort of how we got here. We really established the relationship with A360 after a webinar, not unlike this one. So during COVID, as you may remember, we were doing all kinds of webinars. Many of us were attending them, participating in them. And one of them was actually sharing our work about USAID and some of the technical assistance we were doing with DREAMS programming. And through that process and leveraging of professional networks after that webinar happened, we were able to connect. And I think one of the things that really was evident from the beginning was this idea that we had shared values. And so while BRAC brings this long history of scaling up for adolescent girls, and that really played a crucial role in how we operated in the partnership, also knowing that we both had shared values and goals was really critical to making this all work. And so just to build on that a little bit, when we started our conversations after that webinar with A360, and they were talking about what they were getting ready to embark on, and we were speaking about what BRAC might be able to offer in the way of technical assistance, it was very clear that we both had an openness to learning, that there were benefits for both of us to learn on both sides. So we didn't approach this of BRAC as coming in, as a consultant or a TA firm, and we're here to offer all the answers, but really how do we learn in this process together? And we were very aligned on the ultimate outcome being improved quality of life for adolescent girls and young women. And I think when you have that a shared goal and shared value, it really helps take away some of the ego or protectionism that can come into a partnership. And especially as we're seeing the funding space really narrow and become more competitive and change for NGOs over the past decade or so, it's really thinking about how do we both learn from this? How can there be benefits from this? And having that sort of shared sense of moving forward together feels really critical, particularly in this process. And so we networked to come together. We found out that we had shared values and shared goals. And that's when we started to enter into this idea of a formal partnership and really working through, a contract and all those things that come with the process. And this is where I think we were able to really build on the values and the goals to lead to transparency. And I think when we're going into these spaces of working together with two NGOs coming together, particularly those that might have similar programming, there can be a sense of what can we share, what should we share, how would we share it? And so what we wanted to do really from the beginning was say, how do we create a relationship that's going to work for both organizations, but also a contract that allows us to do that? So when we think about partnerships, there's always the administrative side of it that we also have to be really mindful of. So when we did our contract with A360 and knew we had this commitment behind both of us and the way we wanted to operate, we looked at how the agreements within the contract could make sure we were able to be flexible in the process, how we were able to share data with each other and feel very open about that, and also to share information. And a big part of the contract also was knowing that we were able to make changes as we needed. So as Megan mentioned, we really wanted to be open throughout the process about being able to answer questions as they come up, because technical assistance for us doesn't stop with, the ideation and the plans on paper, but really needs to go throughout the entire process of implementation, because a lot of learning happens during that as well. So when we were thinking about the contract, we had an openness to the way that we could make changes and the way that we could make dates, and some flexibility in working with Megan and her administrative team on how to do that along the way. So when we're thinking about even just sort of the sometimes boring stuff of contracts, it's really important to get those right when we do want to have a partnership that's going to work on both sides and allow us to be able to move through a process in a way that's going to result in something that we both wanted from the very beginning. And I think this collaborative approach and being able to keep in mind what we were aiming for really made sure that all the legal and administrative aspects were taken care of, which is also a really important process. Great. Can we go to the next slide? And so when we think about how did we work through the partnership, I'm just going to talk a little bit about that process. So when this project kicked off, instead of this being, again, like a sort of typical what might come across as a consulting relationship, we really started to think about how do we contribute to research and collaboration. So as Megan mentioned, there was an HCD process that was underway, which was great, and it was bringing in all this fantastic information from young people in the field. When we joined the partnership, that was already kicking off. And so what we got to bring into the table was the research and experience that we had to think about, we've got this coming in from the field, how do we also bring in evidence base and experience that we have within this programming to think about some of these questions that are coming up, and how do we bring that all together then to think about the next step, which would be solutions. But throughout that process, we didn't have a blockage around sharing things like bad news or fearing that if we pushed back on something or gave an alternative opinion, that was going to be a bad thing. We really had the opportunity to see these as learning points along the way, which again was a benefit, I think, for both BRAC and A360 in the process. And so when we were thinking about the conversations and how we took this input from young people and their voices that were coming into the process, we wanted to also think through the implications. So what would be, for example, the sustainability of different ideas, or what had worked in the past and what had not worked in the past. So really bringing together sort of all of that throughout the process allowed us to, again, keep the eye sort of on the prize or the goal, and also have some of those difficult conversations where we brought in different viewpoints or had different discussions along the way. And the key focus for BRAC was how can we bring value add? So when we think about what's being heard in the HCD process and paired that up with existing knowledge and the insights, how do we make sure that we're bringing that to a place that's going to move the process along? And another thing that I think is really important is that at BRAC, we didn't have an assumption that we know everything. So we have a lot of experiences in BRAC. We've been around for over 50 years. We have lots of different programs, as I mentioned, but we also know there are many NGOs like that. And we also know that there are many organizations, including PSI and A360, that are bringing together their experiences. But most importantly, we also have youth bringing in their inputs. And so we really wanted to be on a learning journey together. And I think that contributed in a big way to how we are able to then have these conversations around what context we're working in, what will that look like, how do we adapt what we have for the context, and then how do we make sure that we get feedback on that and do some testing. And so throughout the process, we built on really BRAC's values around looking at how to test, refine, and scale. That's something that is built into the BRAC DNA around being a learning organization, and we really tried to bring that to this partnership as well. So we know that contexts are different, circumstances also change, right? So when you're in the middle of implementation, lots of different things can happen. We also know that different organizations have different strengths, and we wanted to take all of that into consideration when thinking through how do we now, that now that we've learned from the youth, now that we've learned from evidence, now that we've had collaborative discussions together, how do we take all of that and now start applying that to different contexts and really being open to adaptations? And so how do we think about applying best practices in new and different ways? So one example of that is that BRAC has a known youth empowerment program called Empowerment and Livelihood for Adolescents. And this is always based in groups, and it's always been something that we have been able to take into communities in a pretty specific way, although it's had some adaptations over time. But when we started talking to Imnet and her team in Ethiopia, they had already established VSLA groups, or Village Savings and Loan Associations. And so we wanted to think about how would we center our programming rather than just on a community-based group, actually in a VSLA group. And so that was a really interesting way for us to adjust and adapt the model, and a really cool process that we, again, learned a lot from, and Mnet will talk more about that. And then in addition to that, when we thought about sort of the context in Nigeria, the way that Joy was working in the North and the way that she was working in the South were also quite different. So she'll share a bit about that and what that looked like and how we had to, even within a country, think about the different sort of specific contexts that young people are working in and how that needs to make sure that we change throughout the process in order to make sure we're consulting young people and taking into account all of their realities. And I think the last thing I just want to think about with the testing and the feedback process, as you see in the last two boxes on this slide, is we're never wedded to, what we put down on paper is the way. So what we start with and what we put down on paper is a way to interpret the learning and to interpret the young people's inputs and to then take that and test it in the field. And then once we get feedback, we do have to really be ready to adapt that and maybe sometimes start the process all over again. And with PSI, it was great that we were able to have those conversations, have those discussions, and be able to really, again, have those open discussions even as we got into implementation. Just a couple of other things to share. This was a primarily remote process, so we did focus primarily on technical assistance through using video-based trainings, calls, etc. It was during COVID, most of it, and so we really relied on that remote support. That's certainly not always ideal, but it was something that we were able to do and also able to be cost effective throughout the process. And I think it does mean also as a technical assistance partner that you have to really have that openness to, things might have happened one way online, but when we get into reality, we have to be open to revisiting those or going back toward those. And we were really open to doing that throughout the process, just because online training is not always perfect and has its challenges. So I think the last thing that I'll mention is just that, when you're involved in the human-centered design process, as Megan mentioned earlier, there can be this push to sort of invent something new. But when we were going throughout the process, we wanted to make sure we were being innovative and contextualizing, as I mentioned before, but also thinking about how do we make sure we're utilizing this information that we have, resources that we have, models that we have within the context of the fact that we do have limited budgets, right? And we have limited ways that we can implement things in some cases. And so how do we also work within that context of the administrative side of the processes that we have as well? And so we did make sure that we were thinking through how to incorporate all of that as we went through the process. And again, continuing to integrate feedback throughout the relationship. So I will stop there. Looking forward to hearing from Mnet next. So Mnet, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Carrie. Hello, everyone. In the next, Great. So in the next few slides, I'll be sharing some specific examples of how we identified and applied the evidence base across the design process in Ethiopia. So some of what Carrie shared and what Megan shared as well, but I'll also be giving you an overview of what the Smart Steps program in Ethiopia looks like. Next slide, please. So like I said, before I go into discussing the examples, I'd first like to introduce the Smart Steps program. As you can see here, Smart Steps is designed to help married adolescent girls aged 15 to 19 to identify and achieve their financial goals for the future. And it builds off of the Smart Start counseling program that is part of our accelerated programming. When their journey begins, once girls are recruited from Smart Start, they start to build towards their own financial goals. So we have a future mapping exercise that's intentionally built into the process to make sure that girls are supported for their participation by their husbands. So this activity helps them realize that the benefits of involving both women and their husbands in the income generation process will be really beneficial to both parties. So they future map together, and then they move on to the girls independently future mapping by themselves as well. So here what we have is we give the girls the opportunity to deep dive into their own individual future maps to help them articulate their goals and without any external pressure, really articulate their ambitions for the future. So once they've gone through the future mapping exercise by themselves, they are invited to join the Step Up associations to save money, to access low interest loans, and are guided through lessons on a range of topics designed to strengthen their hard and soft skills. So they join these associations, which are self-sustaining and governed by an elected management committee within the group of girls themselves. So here, this is meant to be also a platform to host, experience sharing sessions with other successful business people, and also to build the girls' social capital, as Carrie mentioned earlier, because we want to look at both the economic and the social aspects of their lives. So progressively, once girls have gotten to or reached their benchmarks around attendance and savings, their savings are matched at 150%. So their collective savings, that is. And they get matching grants, which they can use for further loans and generally use amongst individuals as well. So finally, once they've gotten the matching grants, the girls progressively, they can graduate from the program, they become Step Up Association alumni, inspiring future girls to participate in Smart Steps. So essentially, they'd be the ambassadors going around the community, recruiting other girls into the program. So in a nutshell, that's the Smart Steps program. Next slide, please. So as Megan was also mentioning, the Smart Step program was the output of a design process. And like any other research process, when we started this, we started with a literature review and orientation onto what's known about the challenges and solutions around economic empowerment. But what was different with this process was that it was slightly difficult to grasp the entire economic empowerment landscape, because unlike our SRH programming, whose desired outcomes were fewer, more straightforward. So for example, we were looking at more uptake or no uptake. That was more straightforward than economic empowerment, which had many more moving parts. So referring to the evidence base multiple times was more important to us here, because progress with economic empowerment wasn't immediately apparent, especially as we were prototype testing for short periods of time. We couldn't really pinpoint what was working or not immediately. So it was really important for us to engage with the evidence base at different stages of the process. So as you can see, we refer to the evidence base throughout the design process, at the insight gathering stage to validate our insights, and during the prototype testing and refinement stages to connect opportunities with existing solutions. So we really didn't have to recreate everything or invent the wheel. And then, what I'll share in the next few slides will also be how at different levels we use the evidence base to guide our design as well. Next slide, please. So there are three examples that are shared, and the first one here is how at a higher level we refer to the evidence base to identify a working model. So during our insight gathering, we had identified that girls lacked strong peer networks, they needed foundational skills, they doubted their ability to generate income, and also had ambitions, but didn't know where to start. So, but also we had started to test rough prototypes that were addressing very different needs through several independent components. So we had, something that would try and address the social component. We had something that would try and address their self-confidence and their ability to generate income. But these things were tried independently. So, but ultimately, the design team wanted to provide one holistic solution to support girls. So making sure that we're not missing the pieces that would help girls thrive at the end. So as we were trying to piece separate working components together, this is where Brock's support was really helpful, and they helped us explore existing models for group-based solutions. So this led to our adoption and adaptation of the village savings and loan association models. So which are, as the name implies, they're group associations that offer savings and loan components. But these are also built off of the concept of women's empowerment collectives. So we took that concept and also adapted it. And we'll see in the next few slides how the adaptation also went as well. So this is just an example of how on a higher level, the evidence base supported us. And on the next few slides, I'll get a bit more specific as well. Next slide, please. So once the model was identified, like I said, it was up to us to adapt it to fit the unique needs that we were seeing on the field, then the unique needs of the girls that we were seeing on the field. So a big part of doing that was developing content for the participatory learning piece. So in addition to the savings and loan services that girls would get from these associations, we had a learning piece that needed a curriculum. So through prototyping, we had started to gain a good understanding of what kind of skills girls lacked, and that it wasn't enough just to organize girls into savings and loan groups. So we needed to build girls' skills in a number of areas. So their budgeting skills, expenditure and profit, confidence, negotiation, and also general action skills amongst their peers and even with elders in the community. We also knew that girls preferred some different formats in terms of learning. So they liked to learn through stories, and they needed a low literacy approach. So we could see that when we were taking out paper and pen, it would intimidate them. So we could really understand what kind of format would be most beneficial to this environment. So, well, and to be honest, even though in earlier rounds of testing, we had adapted curriculum from different places, we pulled things for the sake of low prototype testing from different places. When it came to testing on a larger scale, our team wasn't equipped to design a whole skills curriculum. It was a giant project within an already large project. So we tapped into BRAC's curriculum expertise and took advantage of existing content that could be rapidly adapted for our context and used to give girls a high quality experience. So as you can see here, we didn't necessarily have to build something new. We could actually adapt it and make it work for this context. Here we were able to use BRAC's ELA curriculum that Carrie just mentioned, and we could quickly pull it together for a robust program for testing. Next slide, please. So the last example I'll share will be on how we use the evidence base for targeted problem solving. So after our first round of live prototyping and even with our new curriculum, we could see and we identified, a few problems. So we could see a few problems, particularly around girls' motivations to association meetings regularly and also save long-term. So girls didn't seem to find attending some of these meetings important, or they would send their money. So they'd give their money to a friend and send it through their friend, make sure that their savings is accounted for, but wouldn't attend the sessions. This meant that they were missing out on the social capital parts. As I was saying earlier, these associations were also meant to act as platforms for girls to interact with other girls and also interact with maybe even other business people in their community. So they were missing out on this component of the program. Secondly, after sometimes we could also see that girls were discouraged by the small amount of money or savings that they had and didn't feel it was sufficient for taking loans. So they would, save and save and save, and at some point, the amount of loans they could access wasn't, they couldn't actually get them anywhere. So they were discouraged by that. So very few girls would access loans, and ultimately even the savings amounts would go down because girls would find more value in using the money elsewhere. So what we wanted to do at that point was to incentivize girls to attend the program because, the skills, the lesson component was also there, and then the social component was also there. But we also wanted them to access more capital. However, our dilemma was that we were concerned about the reporting burden of the individual cash transfers. If we were to provide cash transfers to each of these girls, it would be, the administrative burden would be really high, and also tracking would be very challenging as well. One thing that was quite interesting when we spoke to BRAC about how to manage these was that one we could also find through examples, different examples, such as the one shared here, from that it was groups, not individuals, taking these matching grants or getting these cash transfers, which meant that girls would be collectively accountable to the money they would get and collectively accountable to their attendance, to their savings amount, and making sure that they are growing together as well. So this encouraged us to build towards the matching grants component of this program. And we finally managed to incentivize girls, which led to better savings and better attendance throughout the program. So this is the last example I'll share, which was particularly focused on how the evidence base supported us in terms of problem solving during testing as well. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up, as I mentioned, we could see different areas and different levels where the evidence base was really supportive, and how we worked with Brock's team to kind of answer and support the program throughout. So with Brock's support, the evidence base helped us pull together the insights into a cohesive program modality, which was the VSLA model, had ready-made content, which helped us avoid reinventing the wheel, and also accelerated finding solutions to problems throughout the design process, which came at ad hoc moments. Thank you. That was all from my side. Joy, over to you. Thank you.
I think, Joy, you're still muted, just FYI.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, thank you so much, Mnet, and thank you everyone for staying with us. I'll be talking about how we're able to address misalignment between the evidence base and the user insights. Next slide. So I want to start by introducing the MMA Plus program, which is a program that we co-designed with girls with the goal of layering economic strengthening on adolescent sexual reproductive health, supporting girls to work towards their goals, their life goals. And so what you have here is the girl user journey, where a girl, we start with community buy-in and mobilization. So this is where community leaders and male interpersonal agents talk about the program and talk about how they'll participate in the program, and then girls are invited to sign up for the MMA Plus program. And girls are invited either by program mentors in the community or even by their husbands after engaging with a male interpersonal communication agent. And so once girls are mobilized into the program, their first content is the sexual reproductive health and soft skills. This is a series of 4 classes, 4 sessions that is focused on providing sexual reproductive health knowledge and building soft skills for the girls. And so once a girl is done with the 4 classes, she progresses in the program into a secondary phase or a secondary package. And here she learns about businesses. She picks up financial skills around budgeting and savings, skills around starting businesses. And so she has the girls that are in this program, they have the opportunity of starting a savings group at this phase, and they also get support to start new businesses. So once a girl is done upskilling around business and taking up financial skills, she moves on in the program to take up technical skills, where we encourage girls to take up non-traditional skills. We also have access to traditional skills as well. So girls have time to actually pick up income generating skills, which they can actually use to for business and for empowerment. And so a girl exits this phase and moves on to the next phase, which is for coaching and mentoring of the girls. And so here we have mentors who work with girls to develop their individual business plan. And so using the financial literacy that they've gotten and the technical skills that they've gotten, they pull all this information together to develop a business plan in line with their goals and in line with the skills that they've taken up. And so the last phase for this journey is when a girl graduates, and this graduation is paired with a marketplace. And so it's an opportunity for girls to be celebrated by the community. It's an opportunity for girls to showcase all they've learned, the skills that they have learned. And it's also opportunity for girls to be able to market their services and market their product as well. And so a girl exits the program at this point. So next slide, I'll be talking about the few misalignments that we saw even as we designed. And so as we were designing, we saw that insight and evidence actually could diverge. So in some instances, we saw a disconnect between the evidence base and the user preferences. Like Megan mentioned earlier on, we were heavy on human-centered design. And like Mnet also just mentioned, we were also heavy on evidence as well. And so we wanted to marry this, but we saw that in some cases there were some disconnect. And this actually makes sense because adolescent girls, even from the same geography, we've seen that they are heterogeneous. They are not, it's not one cap fit all. And so it made a lot of sense. But we using human-centered design, we needed to be cautious so that we are not reinforcing what was comfortable or normal for girls, as this could actually reinforce negative gender norms. And so we needed to apply some caution there. So there was need for us to dig deeper, even as we implemented, to learn the barriers, between best practices or what evidence says and what was like the reality for girls in adapting or running with best practices. So I have a couple of examples to share with us. Next slide. Okay, so the first example is talking about saving in groups. So the evidence that guided our design was that empowerment collectives, especially having joint businesses, actually had positive results for women and girls. And the insight that we saw and heard from the field was that girls preferred group learnings, but individual businesses. And we saw that learning as a group was something that girls saw was effective, something that they saw was efficient because they felt that they could learn from each other and share experiences as well. But then there was some form of mistrust among girls groups, especially in their peers. And so especially when money is involved. So when it comes to savings, they could handle or deal with saving because at that point they save, they see what they are saving, and then they know exactly what they have on ground. But when we try to encourage and push for them to actually do businesses together, we saw girls pulling back, and the issue of mistrust, that gap was really widened. And interestingly, we saw that some key influencers, especially husbands, shared similar sentiments as well, talking about not wanting their wives to get involved with wrong people or get into trouble. And so we saw that for group businesses, it wasn't really like coming together for girls. You could see, we heard a girl saying that the group prototype does not work because truth is hard to find among friends. It's hard for people to trust each other, and so she cannot trust them in even to do business together. And so what we learned was that for savings, groups needed to build trust for that savings to even commence. And so we saw some level of spontaneous initiation of group-based savings while girls were in the program. But for group-based businesses, it still remains a challenge, but a potential as well, because we heard girls talk about what they needed to be in place for them to be able to try group businesses. Like a girl who mentioned that should like to do some level of group business like rental collectives if the people that are involved actually are trustworthy and if they are considerate. Next slide, please. Okay, so my second example is around access to capital. So the evidence that guided our design process was that formal financial institutions and services are important step. It's an important step to economic empowerment. But the insights that we heard and gathered on the field as we were working with girls and their key influencers was that there was a general lack of trust. First, general lack of knowledge and information around opportunities to access capital. So there was this lack of knowledge, lack of information around private investors, around government schemes and grants, and even around microfinance. And this kind of led to some level of mistrust among girls and their influencers for these structures, or for these for these structures that were available. And so we saw that there was limited information. And with limited information, we saw that girls were tending more towards informal community loan structures for them to access capital. We also saw that there was mistrust for government because of maybe failed promises in time past, or based on failed promises. And so there's just this pullback. And so the challenge is that if there's unwillingness to engage with some of the government and microfinance institutions, then there's a challenge to sustainability. And so what we are trying to work around is how can NGOs work with financing partners in order to build trust, other things that fuel issues of mistrust is, especially for the private sector, is around repayment schedule, around high interest rates, and so it further makes it complex. It further makes it complex how girls are able to access capital for their economic empowerment, or for their economic empowerment journey. Next slide, please. So my last example is around business choices in conservative settings. So we saw that girls were the evidence that guided us was that promoting non-traditional skills facilitates higher paid income generating opportunities. But we saw that girls preferred traditional skills over non-traditional skills. And as we worked with girls were tending more towards the traditional skills that they were used to. They were gravitating more towards this. And this we saw was majorly because most of the women in the community, that is, those are the skills that they do. Most of the female entrepreneurs in the community, they work around these traditional skills. And so most girls, even when we tried to shift them towards non-traditional skills, would always like fall back, to what they are used to. And that we saw was really a very strong norm. So we can see a quote here where we heard that women run businesses at home, and there's a market for just for women where they are able to trade and shop. And so these norms are actually very, very strong. And so when we implemented this program, we didn't have enough time, or neither did we have the funding for this radical norm shift around the kind of income generating skills that girls would pick up that can actually lead to economic autonomy. We saw that girls are really, really savvy, working around the existing restrictions that the norms have set in place. And we are looking at how we can actually take you from the way girls are already operating and supporting them to push boundaries, boundaries safely, so that they are able to involve and engage in other skills that are non-traditional. During the implementation, we tried and kind of pushed for skills around solar panel, photography, and we also looked at making pads, sanitary pads. And of these non-traditional skills, the ones that girls really gave positive feedback on was, making of the sanitary pads, reusable sanitary pads, which they talked about having high potential for profit. And so we're like more open to it, but then there's still more work required to actually get this to be ingrained. Next slide, please. So I just want to conclude by saying that even when we have misalignments between evidence and user insight, it's not a bad thing, because this just tells us that there are important contextual factors that we need to take in place and take into consideration. And this reminds us what works in one geography might not necessarily work in another. What works in one situation might not always work in another. And some of the misalignments are not easily resolved. And so we need more learning and research to understand better how to implement in the different geographies for those that want to replicate. And finally, I want to say that some of the best practice indeed need to be filtered through users' lived experiences. And so as we have best practices, as we have evidence-based, it's always important to run it through users' lived experiences to see what actually can work and what will not work, what we can operationalize and what we can't. So I want to say thank you so much and hand over to Mary. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joy. And really to all of our presenters. I think we covered a ton of ground over the last hour. We talked about the background of this initiative, the actual partnership itself and what it took to get it off the ground and how it worked. And then, I think we got into some really detailed examples of how this worked in practice and what these new multi-component initiatives for girls look like in Ethiopia and Nigeria. So just huge thank you to our panelists for explaining it, hopefully clearly. We've had a lot of engagement in the Q&A window. I encourage people to continue to put your questions in. We've got a good amount of time dedicated now to answer some of these questions. Some of them are quite specific, I'm seeing, to the individual initiative, so we'll get to those. But I'd actually like to start with sort of a more general question that I'm hoping Carrie and Megan can speak to, which is really just thinking about these partnerships. What advice would you have for others who want to set up similar partnerships? I mean, we can sort of start from that general space and then get into more specific.
Sure, I'm happy to start, and then Carrie, I'd love to hear your reflections as well. I think from our side, maybe the first step is to just acknowledge with humility when we're being asked to expand into an area where we don't actually have a good foundation of expertise. I think sometimes that can feel risky to kind of admit maybe that we can't do things on our own, but it's really important, or it was important in our case, to approach this kind of work with humility and say, okay, well, though we have an aspiration to be good at this kind of integrated work that looks at economic empowerment and SRH, we know that our wheelhouse really right now is SRH. And so we need to find a partner who's going to provide that expertise to us and for us and with us. So I think approaching it with humility is really important from the outset. I want to go back to something Carrie also said, which was about the importance of transparency. I know I said to Carrie so many times over our years in working together that it's just so wonderful to come to a partner with questions and know that they're not going to be keeping things close to their chest out of propriety, not wanting to share information with us because we're, ultimately competitive peers in this space. We know that the funding landscape is changing, and so sometimes that can make us feel really protective and have to hold things close to our chest. But what was so wonderful about this partnership in particular was that we committed from the outset to come together and be fully transparent with information. And so I think for others who are looking to set up that kind of partnership, establishing that transparency from the outset is really important. But I think it's also complex to do that from like a logistics standpoint. We are individuals, but we're part of broader organizations that have their own kind of requirements. And so, Carrie mentioned this, but setting up that kind of contractual relationship was a little bit tricky because we did have to navigate, okay, what does it mean that we're using, for example, BRAC's content and skills curriculum in some of our work? So how do we acknowledge their contribution and the source of that? So interrogating those questions from the outset, I think, really did help us as well. So it's this interesting marriage of transparency, but also, acknowledging that we come with organizational baggage, so to speak, that we're trying to get past within that partnership. But I think the commitment, also going back to something Carrie said, the fact that we had shared goals allowed us to work through the complexities of that, both from the outset when we were establishing the relationship, but also throughout the process. And I think that was really, really valuable. But yeah, Carrie, I'd love to hear if you have anything to add.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. I definitely agree with everything you've said. The only other thing I would add is that piece around flexibility. I think that shows up in so many different ways. So being able to, take in new information when it comes in from the field and work around that. If there's a new need that arises, being able to deal with that, having, flexibility within the partner's schedule. Flexibility within the partner schedule to be able to respond to inquiries. So making sure that, whoever is going to be leading up the partnership on both sides also has that ability within their other portfolio items they might be working on. So that word, I think, encompasses a lot of key things that need to happen within a partnership for it to be successful as well. And I think it just builds on everything that Megan just said. Mary, back to you.
Great, thank you both. So we do have a few questions on the approach in Ethiopia. And I'm actually wondering if we should start with this question about just providing a little bit more detail about how SRH is being integrated into the savings groups in Ethiopia. And I'm not sure if Mnet or Megan, which of you would prefer to just provide a very brief overview of our Smart Start curriculum.
Mnet, please. I consider you more of an expert.
Oh, please, Megan, you flatter me. So thank you for your questions. These are really insightful questions. So just to clarify, as I mentioned, maybe we can also go to the slide, but our SRH programming actually precedes Smart Steps in Ethiopia. So what we have is the counseling session between, ideally for the couple, the married adolescent girl and her husband, which starts off with a financial entry point. So essentially asking the couple to think about where they want to be a few years down the line and what they want to achieve. So a very aspirational program design. So looking at where they want to be, and then towards how contraceptives are a tool to get towards those achieving those goals. So we start off with that, and then, of course, they get the SRH counseling in depth with the health extension worker at the community level. And once they've gotten, if they, of course, decide to uptake the contraceptives, they'll go through that route. And then through that, they are channeled to our economic empowerment programming. So it precedes the economic empowerment component. So maybe, Megan, if you want to add anything. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is that one learning for us in this integration piece, and there's a practitioner tool that we put out earlier this year that kind of talks about this a little bit. But one key piece of learning for us was that yes, it was important that integration happened from the outset, but also there was value in reinforcing that SRH messaging throughout the context, the whole sort of economic empowerment journey. And I think that's something that actually MMA also does really well, because you have this integration of health related topics throughout the skills curriculum that's provided. And I think we saw in the outcomes from testing this work that reinforcement over time is actually really important for us to see the economic empowerment component amplify the SRH outcomes. So if you just integrate them at one point, you're probably going to see the same level of SRH outcomes as for the SRH only intervention. But if you're reinforcing it over time, then actually the SRH outcomes get greater with the addition of the economic empowerment component, if that makes sense. So I think that definitely was one key learning for us also on the importance of full integration over time.
Thank you both. And maybe just a quick follow-up there's a question from Betty about sort of, what tools are we using to target and track girls through graduation and do data collection. And so I think, Smart Start was the initial way that we identified girls, and then they were recruited that way. And it was a very low tech operation. But you could just speak maybe a little bit to the local implementing partners that we worked with once we got to the pilot stage. So after this design phase, what it looked like a little bit. Megan or Emmett again, probably.
Yeah, I can. So when we took this work into pilot, we recruited 2 local implementing partners who were responsible for the facilitation of the work on the ground. And so we created essentially a monitoring form, and I'm sure Mary, you also probably have more detail on this because I know you worked with the team. But we created a monitoring form that the LIPs, these local implementing partners, use to track certain indicators over time for participants who were participating in Smart Steps. Things like, the group savings pot, how much savings have been contributed to the collective pot that the groups had, who was taking loans, whether the loans were repaid, things that they could track on a routine basis. So we relied on that piece to give us some longitudinal data over time on what was happening within the groups. But there was also an evaluation component. So we looked at the kind of baseline and end line outcomes that were generated for participants in the group. But the tool that we used for monitoring was originally paper-based, but ultimately was in a bit of a database format, but not super sophisticated, as Mary said.
Thanks, Megan. This is a question that I think came out of the Ethiopia presentation, but actually I think Carrie and Joy might also have some really interesting things to say. Bernadette was asking about, is there an issue engaging girls in economic activities when they should be accessing their right to education? So I'd sort of like to open that up to all of our panelists, maybe to speak a little bit about these sub-cohorts of girls that we saw, very different audiences in Ethiopia, Northern Nigeria, Southern Nigeria, and sort of how economic empowerment interplays with education depending on the context. So I open it up to the panelists who want to jump into this meaty question first.
Okay, thank you so much, Mary. Interestingly, we've seen that a lot of social and cultural contexts that affect girls, especially in northern Nigeria, and their education. And so we saw cases where girls got married early, and so could not continue, school. And so meeting them and enrolling them in the MMA Plus program. When we talk about goal setting, we hear a lot of girls who want to go back to school, who desire to go back to school, but then don't really have the means to do that. And so when we are able to empower them economically, when we're able to help them strengthen their economic base, we saw that girls were actually contributing to their school expenses. We saw girls who were now able to get back to school. We did a post-pilot evaluation and looked at girls who were saving money, girls who were earning money, and how they were using their savings. And we saw one of the questions we asked was around if they were contributing to, their schooling in any way. And we saw that, yes, some girls were actually contributing to school in terms of buying school materials or even transporting to school. And so to answer your question, I think that I believe that economic empowerment, one way or the other, will still support their education, because in reality, especially for girls in low resource settings, for girls who don't have the opportunity to support themselves in school, who don't have somebody to support them in school, economic empowerment is actually their way to get back to school and to continue their education. I don't know if Mnet will want to share as well. So over, Mnet, over to you.
Thank you, Joy. Well, I was actually going to say that in Ethiopia, similar to Nigeria, most of these girls have already dropped out of school because of economic reasons, and in order to continue to higher education or even to high school, they'd have to move away from home, and their housing, all of their costs have to be covered, and they're not able to do that. So instead of continuing their education, actually marriage becomes the next step. So in this scenario, once girls have been married, most of the girls don't really see education as a viable path towards achieving success. It's not, we're really not competing with education. I didn't feel like, or we didn't see in the community that we were competing with education. I think what the buy-in we needed was more from their husbands and their community members to, make room for girls to generate income, to encourage them to participate in economic activities. So that was more of the barrier than kind of competing with education. Yeah.
I can just add briefly, I think the way to, think about this challenge of economic empowerment and education is that there are groups of young people where their realities are such that returning to school is not an easy fix, right? And sometimes it's impossible. And so when we're thinking about contextualization, we do need to take that into consideration. And so for both Nigeria and Ethiopia, when we looked at curriculum content, for example, it looks a bit different in southern Nigeria, where Joy's team had more young people who were in school than it did in northern Nigeria, where they had more young people who were out of school. So also making those differentiations for the groups that you're working with and the realities that they're living. And then I think they both mentioned the point about, goal setting included in the curriculum and the content, and how do you make sure that you're supporting them toward their goals, whether that includes school or it doesn't, and it will for some and will not for others, and making sure that you're supporting them with linkages as needed to, if you're not an education program, because the fix to get girls back to education once they've dropped out, as I'm sure everybody well knows, is quite complicated. And so making sure you can be a part of the solution in your program and not contributing to any further challenges, I think is the best angle to take on that.
Thank you. That was exactly what I hoped we'd get from all of you. I see some questions around sort of what were girls, what was their success with the VSLAs and the income generating activities. So I think it would be interesting, Joy and Mnet, for you and Carrie, if you want to add, to talk a little bit about what sorts of businesses we saw girls engage with. Again, recognizing that, they're all 15 to 19. Some of them have very low levels of education. They often have a child at home. What was realistic in terms of the businesses that we saw them pursue? Maybe Emna, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think similar to what Joy was presenting earlier on, income generating activities closer to home. So poultry farming, small vegetable farms in their own compounds, so they could go out and sell these commodities in it. We could also see girls opening up souks or like small shops where they would even, charge phones for people for a small fee. So things that were quite close to home, but also manageable, and they could have their children at home with them. They could, do their chores while overseeing their business as well. So similar, I think that kind of captures it, but poultry definitely. Over to you, Joy, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you, and so okay, yes. So uh, um, we also saw um, just like Emna said, a lot of individual business.
Sorry, we're having some connection problems.
And so gain income generating skills that and mostly it was home-based, have people supply for them to make Vaseline. Girls who made, maybe people within the community who could help like distribute shops or to other homes. Those are the kind of businesses that we get involved and engaged in, and tailoring. And so we had girls baby clothes and sell. We had girls who were making beddings, who were making throw pillows, and selling so household things. So we saw a whole lot of this in Nigeria. Over.
Thanks, Joy. I think you cut out a little bit, but we sped up at the end there. And I think you were saying also home-based businesses, sewing, catering. We had a few girls do shoemaking, makeup and hair, stuff like that. Is that right? Yeah. Let's see what else we've got in here. I know some of these questions have been answered in the chat, but I think that there were a few questions about still about the SRH component. And Megan, maybe if you just want to voice over what we were specifically measuring in the SRH piece, and then there was a question about sort of husband willingness or openness to use of contraception. And I think it'd be great to hear from Nigeria and Ethiopia sort of about how that played out after you give a little intro, Megan.
Sure, yeah. Because we were evaluating these as layered economic empowerment components, when we facilitated the evaluation, we were looking at the differences in outcomes between the integrated intervention group, so a group that received the SRH and economic empowerment intervention combined, compared to a group that received only the SRH intervention. So we were really looking at, does the economic empowerment component amplify the SRH outcomes or increase the SRH outcomes compared to girls who just received an SRH only intervention? And the specific outcomes around SRH that we were looking for were, of course, current contraceptive use, but also intent to use contraception. I think we know in many cases adolescent girls' patterns of contraceptive use vary over time. They're intermittent, they're not consistent. And so we wanted to look not just at whether girls were currently using, but whether they, intended to use at some point in the future. And that's particularly important for populations of unmarried adolescent girls, like those that we supported in southern Nigeria, because we know that current contraceptive use might just not be relevant for them at a certain point. And then we were also looking at more knowledge-related indicators and belief in the relevance of contraception, because I think one thing that we find really a critical barrier to uptake is that when you ask girls, do you believe that contraception is relevant to you achieving your goals, is a relevant tool for you to use? Many times they say no. So a key aspect of our work was really trying to establish for girls that contraception was actually a relevant tool for them to use to be able to support them in preventing unintended pregnancies or delaying and spacing pregnancies so that they could achieve their goals. So from a general standpoint, those are the kind of outcomes that we were looking at. I guess over to you, Emnet or Joy, to talk about the kind of husband support for contraceptive use and what we see.
Okay, thank you, Megan. I was just typing, responding in the chat. Okay, yes, we saw husbands receptive to contraceptive uptake for married adolescent girls, majorly because from the very start we had an engagement, we had an intervention or a component designed for husbands of married adolescent girls. And even for the unmarried, we had a component designed for mothers of the unmarried adolescent girls as well. And so this we saw improved and provided enabling environment for both married and unmarried girls to access contraceptives. And just like Megan said, for some, especially for the unmarried, it was more futuristic, and we saw that mothers were they supported that, having their daughters like get the information that they needed, and even for those that needed contraceptive while we were piloting and implementing, yes, they could take up methods. So husband support, yes, we got a lot of that with the male engagement that we had going on in the community. Over to you, Emnet.
Happy to also maybe talk about this since I know Emnet, you weren't engaged in the pilot. I think very similarly to what Joy is referencing for Nigeria, we saw a lot of husband support for contraceptive use in Ethiopia. And I think one critical aspect of that was beginning with that SRH intervention and then using that intervention as a platform to get into more economic empowerment. And it kind of mentioned that the Smart Start counseling tool which is the SRH intervention key sort of approach, it has messaging that really establishes the importance of contraceptive use and how delaying and spacing can help girls and couples achieve their goals. And so because we're beginning with that piece, that really helps to establish the support that girls need from their partners to use contraception. So I think that's something that was within A360's wheelhouse, something that we really knew how to do. And so we were less concerned about our ability to be able to establish support from girls' partners for their contraceptive use, just because that's what the program has been doing for since 2016. So I think we do already see quite high support there.
Thanks, Megan. We are almost at time. Joy, maybe I'll shoot you one more question. Emnet sort of talked about this in a way that the Carrie's support helped the team, but talking about avoiding dropouts throughout the span of the economic empowerment programming, which is quite a bit longer than our SRH programming. You saw crazy high attendance in Nigeria. So maybe you could just speak a little bit about that. How do you avoid dropout? What's the level of interest from girls in general? How do they graduate?
Okay, thank you, Mary. So basically, I would say follow up, intensive follow up. We had program mentors who were focused on the SRH and soft skills building, and then we had business mentors who were focused on the financial literacy, coaching, mentoring. And so we had this group of mentors helping to follow up with girls. We also had mobilizers on the field. We had mentors on the field who were helping to follow up. So we had like a system, a network. But having said this, we saw that in northern Nigeria, continuation was much, much better That's where we programmed for married adolescent girls, compared to Southern Nigeria, where we programmed for unmarried adolescent girls. So there we had like more drop off because of girls who had to go back to school, girls who enrolled in the program while they were on holiday, and then eventually had to return back to school or leave town or something like that. And so those were the nuances that we saw. But for the level of completion that we saw, it was intensive follow-up from multiple fronts that helped us with this.
Thanks, Joy. I think we are at time, so I am going to cut off questions there. Thank you so much, everybody, for your engagement and these interesting questions. We will be sending out a follow-up email with the slide deck and with the recording. We'll include some contact information in there in case you want to strike up a partnership similar to this one. We can explore that. But thank you so much, and thanks again to all of our panelists who worked very hard to present today. So really appreciate everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day or evening.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.